we will hope to see you in Mumbai with a fresh theme and fresh papers. But this time we will have to just, do it this way. So, Michael, I must tell you that yesterday's short film screening, where you gave us permission to use in association with Kutztown University, was a very, very good session. We will share the links, Srinivas, with them, and you can have a look at the films. They were very good. Okay. And some colleges other than ours also participated in the session. And we had a jury which kind of gave them their inputs, and it went very well. And Jennifer was there in 2019. I think she knows how we screen the films. So we will share some documentary films also, which our students made last year. So without taking much of our time, let's start. And I expecting the principal anytime to join. Yeah. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Thank you. Should I go first or Urszula? How are we doing this? I'm happy to let you go.
Whichever you prefer.
Yeah, Michael.
Michael, Ritti will introduce you people. Our professor is sitting next to me.
Okay.
And then you can start the presentations. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So I should start. Okay.
Hello. Good evening. Yes.
Good evening.
Yes. Yes, for everyone, small introduction for Dr. Michael Johnston. So Dr. Johnston is an associate professor and department chair, Department of Cinema, Television, and Media Production, Kutztown University, Pennsylvania. Professor Johnston teaches film and video production, film theory and history, and screenwriting at Temple University and Rowan University. His research interests include early cinema and architecture in film. His films have screened at national and international film festivals. His films, Reena and A Man Full of Trouble, has won multiple screenwriting and film festival awards. So this is an introduction for him. The platform's all yours. Over to you.
Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. I'm really glad that we're able to make this work, and I'm super excited to see the short films and to figure out how to do more of this stuff. When you invited us to speak, the idea of the conference about visual literacy, I think that one of the things that happens for us sometimes as professors is we teach, and then we teach again, and then we teach again, and 10 years later, you're like, I think I figured out what went wrong with that class. And so actually, tonight's presentation is a bit of a kind of a mix of sort of a bit of my research in film and in screenwriting and ideas of art and formalism, but also somewhat of my theories on teaching. I'm glad that Jen is here because Jen and I both teach this class called Masterpieces in Film History, which I think is one of the most kind of, we didn't name the class, and that's part of the discussion. It's one of the most kind of oddly named classes, and it led to a series of confusion that I think is kind of interesting. I believe I can share the screen, correct? Okay. All right, so I apologize that I will be reading off a piece of paper, but I could not memorize this, and I ate lots of candy to stay awake, so we'll see how the sugar kicks in. All right, so I don't know how to respond to this movie because it breaks every rule I was ever taught. A student said this to me in Masterpieces. This was in 2016. This was the first time I had taught the class at Kutztown. And I remember this so vividly. I remember the student. I will not name him, even though I adore him. He was a great student. But in that moment, I never thought a student would suggest that there was a limit to the very education that they were currently receiving, and that watching a rule-breaking film would go against their learning rather than to contribute to it. I was shocked that the student didn't see this as a leaping off point and a further development of what he had been taught of how film vocabulary and film grammar can be deconstructed or reconstructed and contribute to the evolution of visual language. The student, a good student, was shocked into a non-response, which is perhaps the most terrifying concept to any teacher or filmmaker. Now, I had not screened a shocking film nor an obscure film. The film was especially Ingmar Bergman's Pruchniewska, time was ranked the 17th greatest film ever made, according to the 2012 Sight and Sound poll of critics and directors. Filmmaker Vincent Gallo stated in an interview that if critics wanted to gang up on him and trash his movie Buffalo 66, that they could in fact do that. They could destroy the quote unquote life of the movie, meaning they could convince people not to see it, which in turn would ruin its ability to generate box office, and as a result be pulled from the theaters. The critics could destroy the life of the movie, but they can never destroy the film's quote unquote impact. The impact of a film, as Gallo defined it, was how a piece of cinema can affect, influence, connect, and possibly change the life of an individual on a deeply personal level. Impact, in my estimation, is unteachable and a concept that professors should avoid. A professor that states this film will change your life should also begin many classes with this film will not change your life in any way because you've seen it before, it's predictable, you know the story beats, you know the structure, you know the characters, and you know all this with your ears and eyes fully closed. The best we teachers can do is curate and hope that students connect with the material that we have chosen in a personal way while expanding the students' concept of what visual art and cinema in particular can do based on its history. I've never considered the professor's role as a tastemaker until becoming one, and I think every teacher must truly consider their responsibility as a tastemaker. In his 1917 essay, Art as Technique, Russian writer and theorist Viktor Shklovsky wrote, "If we start to examine the general laws of perception, we see that as perception becomes habitual, it becomes automatic. And art exists that one may recover the sensation of life. It exists to make one feel things, to make the stone stony. The purpose of art is to impart the sensation of things as they are perceived and not as they are known. The technique of art is to make objects unfamiliar, to make forms difficult, to increase the difficulty and length of perception, because the process of perception is an aesthetic end in itself and must be prolonged. Art is a way of experiencing the artfulness of an object. The object is not important. After we see an object several times, we begin to recognize it. The object is in front of us and we know about it, but we do not see it. Hence, we cannot say anything significant about it. Art removes objects from the automatism of perception in several ways." So Shklovsky is framing his concept of defamiliarization, which is a concept I teach in screenwriting. It's a concept he supports by analyzing the writing of Tolstoy, whereby Tolstoy makes the familiar seem strange by not naming the familiar object. Tolstoy avoids accepted names of the object. Instead, he names corresponding parts of the object. And by avoiding the accepted, the habitual, Tolstoy, in his example, which is describing the flogging of a horse, changes its form without changing its nature. Tolstoy changes the form through his use of language, but he does not change the nature. It's easy to poke holes in any theory, and defamiliarization is no different. Shklovsky was a formalist, and that drove his writings and his point of view. Rather than poke holes or attempt to argue Shklovsky's theory, I'm going to cannibalize it for the good. And a discussion of cinema also leads to a discussion of content. Content, the word that has changed the form of TV and the nature of cinema. When my student stated that persona broke every rule he was ever taught, I wondered where the mistake had been made along the way. To be clear, not every student felt this way. The student response is much like the film frame, followed the rule of thirds. A third loved it, a third hated it, and a third lied and didn't watch the film and said that they had. And I respected all of those approaches. But the teaching and the learning of filmmaking process and the history and theory of the moving image has been disrupted and defamiliarized to an extent. The act of filming now precedes the study of technique. For my generation, films were everywhere and the technology was scarce. Today, the means of production, distribution, and exhibition are ubiquitous and user and/or consumer friendly. The availability of films, from the good to the bad, are scarce and hard to obtain. Many students now possess the tools, the software, the exhibition and distribution models before ever arriving at a university. Some might view this as putting the cart before the horse because students lack the foundational understanding that film is connected to painting, sculpture, architecture, science, theater, literature, and the natural world. Students possess the equipment, they assume the skills, and unfortunately, they can lack the sensibility. The result is they can and often do lack a response when seeing something unfamiliar, something that challenges their production and viewing habits. When Avengers: Infinity War was released, students went mad. They couldn't see it soon enough or see it again soon enough. In a conversation with a different student, that student said to me, "I like to see the same thing over and over again, but each time just slightly different." He said this with a giggle because he was both serious and embarrassed by his pronouncement. In the documentary Side by Side, Martin Scorsese expresses his concern for the limitlessness of the digital image. He fears that kids won't understand what is real and what is not real. And as much as I admire Scorsese, there is a filmmaker by the name of Peter Greenaway who has stated 1 Bill Viola equals 10 Martin Scorseses. Bill Viola is an American video artist who is quite phenomenal. Greenaway has also stated that cinema is dead, long live the cinema. So I want to follow Peter Greenaway for a moment. He's a filmmaker whose call to action has always been to change both the form and the nature of cinema. His greatest, most expansive project, The Tall Slipper Suitcases, is a film trilogy, a series of websites, a series of books, a video game, a traveling museum exhibition, and a live performance where the filmmaker live edits the movie in front of an audience. It also travels around the world to different locations, and it incorporates the environment into the projections. In his Cinema Militans lecture, Greenaway identified the 4 tyrannies of cinema. Greenaway stated that art is driven by the technology it employs, and cinema has died because it never reinvented itself. It became dominated by the tyranny of the text, tyranny of the frame, tyranny of the actor, and tyranny of the camera. My favorite being the tyranny of the actor, which is that cinema is not a playground for Sylvester Stallone. But Tall Slipper is more myth than narrative and more invention than cinema. The limitlessness of Greenaway's cinematic mythological creation broke every convention of traditional narrative filmmaking. And I personally remain obsessed with Looper, which has had an enormous impact on me. Much to Gallo's point, the life of Looper died quickly. The 3 films were actually forced to be edited down into a single feature film for commercial release and failed, and Looper's impact has yet to be determined. Unlike Martin Scorsese, I do not care about the reality of the image. I care about the production of the image and what informed its creation. What is the source of its value and not its projected meaning? Those, in my estimation, are teachable, and Scorsese's point is not. Should I really test my students on whether or not this image of the Eiffel Tower is made of steel or made of pixels? Or do I teach how that same image has been built in both steel and pixels and connect the 2 worlds of artistic creation? Because as a filmmaker and a professor, there's a technology, there is an aesthetic, and there is a budget to both models. They are not exclusive, they are very much married. And they are both informed images. And given their birth dates, both change the form and the nature of their respective mediums at that time. So much in the same way that Greenaway has multiple loopers, one in a museum, one in a film, one in a live cinema performance, and one on a website, he is changing the form and the nature. As Shklovsky said, art exists so that one may recover the sensation of life. It exists to make one feel things, to make the stone stony. The purpose of art is to impart the sensation of things as they are perceived and not as they are known. The technique of art is to make objects unfamiliar, to make forms difficult, to increase the difficulty and length of perception because the process of perception is an aesthetic end in itself and must be prolonged. My favorite part is to make the stone stony because it is not pretentious, it's actually concrete. I believe we must teach students to make the stone stony. Greenaway clearly makes the cinema because he refuses to engage the habits of the filmmaker and the audience. He often says, "Why are we sitting in the dark staring at a screen in one direction? Man is not a nocturnal animal, and cinema is all around us." Greenaway's cinema imparts the sensation of the thing, and that thing is the cinema, which can be defined by its component pieces of camera, lights, editing, sound design, performance, and music. All the formal elements that create our perception of cinema and not what we know as cinema. Because what we know as cinema can fail us. It can fail to make us respond when we are presented with that cinematic experience that embodies the process of perception, which is aesthetic and must be prolonged. What we know about cinema can fail to excite us through its aesthetic habits and predictive patterns. The rule of thirds, the 180-degree rule, match action cutting. Cinema can fail to make the stone stony, and even scarier for me is that the teaching of cinema can fail to make the stone stony. So if we look at some pieces across different media, we see Francis Bacon. Francis Bacon made the painting Painty. Louis Kahn, who made the architecture, which I can't say these words, and Brancusi made sculpture sculptury. Francis Bacon defamiliarized how we perceive the human face, and the form is difficult, but the nature remains. Louis Kahn defamiliarized how and where light enters a space. He lengthened our perception of architecture, and yet the nature remains. Brancusi defamiliarized an intimate moment, and the sensation is felt. Before Bacon, there was Rembrandt, and before Rembrandt, there was another and another. Before Kahn, there was Bernini, and before Bernini, there was another. So obviously you get my point of the historical connections. Before Greenaway, there was Godard and Hitchcock, and before them was Eisenstein and Muybridge, each setting up the springboard for the next. The work of each artist and craftsman was informed by that which preceded it and the materials and technology that shaped its production, which brings me to the world of the content image. Content is a dirty word in film circles, at least it is back home. Its connotation is that it is shallow, that it lacks depth, and is purely narrative and has sullied the purely cinematic image, which is something I beg to differ. I believe that Greenaway is correct, that cinema failed to reinvent itself. Cinema sullied cinema. This is why the Avengers blow lots of things up in the film frame. The visual is in fact worth destroying. And much of recent cinema lacks visual and human value. I have seen the great architecture of New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles blown up in films and scores of people blown up, squashed, or shot. And whether those were real or digital wouldn't matter. The viewer has no time to study their visual or human properties, only their visual destruction. And the viewer has even less time to generate empathy or sympathy because the cause of the destruction is shown but never the result. The content image, on the other hand, unlike the cinema image, has prolonged our perception. It takes its time and it demands that we take our time with the image and with the world it creates. We look around a lot more because we are given more visual information and we stay in the world much, much longer. We binge episodes and we follow visual cues to see if we can determine the result. Content has changed the form of TV and the nature of TV. It is not purely narrative. While it may appear dominated by Greenaway's tyranny of the frame and tyranny of the text, it does so outside its own medium. Content does not suffer from the tyranny of TV, nor does it suffer from the form and nature of TV. Content has reinvented TV in a way that Greenaway demands cinema reinvent itself. Content has extended the properties of art. And when watching shows like Ozark, The Night of, Insecure, Atlanta, The Outsider, The Third Day, we can see the properties of the technology and have a purely aesthetic experience that interacts with our emotional experience. Content has destroyed the tyranny of the TV frame, the tyranny of the TV text, the tyranny of the TV actor, and the tyranny of the TV camera. I see Rembrandt in Ozark. I see landscape artists Richard Long and Andrew Goldsworthy in The Third Day. I see photographers Gordon Parks and Robert Mapplethorpe in The Outsider. There is a reason that my student lacked a response to persona, and it was not because of what he was taught, it was due to what he was not taught. And that falls solely on me, the teacher. In that moment, he was not speaking purely of technique because he could identify a close-up and a jump cut. He was speaking of its place in history and its connection to the past and present visual language. I had tried something different that semester. I had attempted to defamiliarize a class titled Masterpieces of Film History. In my defense, I did not create this class because I don't accept the concept. In creating the syllabus, I became fixated on my disdain for canonized movies and what I perceived as a subjectivity and false labeling of the masterpiece. I changed the form of the class and inadvertently changed its nature, which was not my intention. I curated the class screenings in thematic and stylistic groupings. I screened Robert Altman and Federico Fellini in the same week to study the quote-unquote circus directors, those that could take on large casts. I grouped John Cassavetes and Ilya Kazan together to study the actor's director. And I grouped Ingmar Bergman's persona with Woody Allen's Annie Hall to show how two directors could operate outside the system and treat similar subjects of sex and death with the greatest comedic and dramatic sensibilities. What I had ignored was chronology, the historical timeline that would trace Lumiere to Eisenstein, Eisenstein to Bergman, and Bergman to Allen. I created my own connections rather than those that existed and informed one image to the next and one film to the next. I did not have to screen persona, but I did. I did have to teach film history in chronological order, and I did not. I put the cart before the horse and I learned a lesson. I could have screened a different film from a different country by a different director from that same time period, a film much less regarded, and taught the needed to be made. This is the time period that dates the production of this image, and these are the aesthetic, technological, and economic properties that informed its creation. I needed to teach the visual history of cinema because we all share the evolution of that visual language, which has formed our habits and inspired us to break those habits. I did not teach persona because I did not need to teach persona because the object doesn't matter. Thank you. And I'm definitely open to questions, especially if I picked on persona and people love it. I'm sorry. I feel guilty. Questions, ideas? Jen, have you made the same mistake? You definitely have a better syllabus than me.
No, so I was just curious. I mean, I don't know if you've taught it since that last time, but like, what your thoughts are about it now? Are you?
I continue to change the class around, and I've gone strictly with chronological order. And when I do the chronology, if I do screenings at home, I do sort of direct influences, things that you can actually chart. And I've found that that has been much more effective. I think that the kind of like the professor-driven syllabus, which was sort of, this is my idea of what film history looks like, was maybe a little too personal. And it took me, that was 2016, it's now 5 years later. It took me some time to recognize the fact that it was not persona, but that was the problem. The fact was that students liked it. And when I changed the class around, we all sort of arrived at it at the right time, at the right place. And that made a lot more sense than merely, this is week one of a film history class, watch a movie from the midpoint of the history of cinema. I was glad I took the risk, and I'm glad that that I recognized the fault. And so, but the thing that concerns me as we teach longer and longer, film history gets longer, and how do we continue to compress, 20 years from now to just squeeze in another 20 years of film. So I think we just have to offer more classes.
I think that's just so interesting. Like, that approach, that dynamic approach, like when you're continually like learning from your students and then, reshaping your class, like kind of really thinking about, your journey as a filmmaker through, school, and ultimately continually learning and thinking about like content and, touching on all the things that you said, like regarding, it's really interesting that some of the things that Greenaway mentioned, and sort of changing that form and recontextualizing it in a world where everything is at students' fingertips in a moment. So, at what point do we kind of think about it outside of the frame that it was in before, which was kind of taste based, or whatever other kind of structures were in place to kind of be directives for what film should be seen. I think that it's just really something that we need to be thinking about right now. It's really challenging to kind of figure out like how that perception is working and how we affect that. It was great.
Michael, this is Manjula here from Mumbai.
Yes, hello.
Excellent presentation, Michael.
Thank you.
I just had one comment to make and then a question. The comment is that perception is something which we teach also in journalism and also in media studies. Besides films. And I think a lot of theories have been taught to our students. And of course, we also as students, we have studied. And I think it's like an evolving kind of a thing. Every time there is a concept which you kind of try to understand that how the medium is sending the content to the audience and what media effects does that content have on its receivers in the form of text or in the form of audiovisual content or only audio content. So a lot of research, we also are doing it in the department, and we come out with a lot of interesting perceptions that the survey or the interviews have of the content, which is very Indian in the context. Okay. Now, what my question is that if I look at a professor teaching these things to its student groups constantly, like you talk about 2016, I'm talking about, I've been teaching the students from 2001. And in 20 years, I must have seen at least 7 to 8 revisions of the syllabus. So this is the tyranny of a professor I'm talking about, that it's very difficult to have the best, most updated content for your students. So you go to the classroom and you know it is stale, it is boring, sometimes it is outdated. But don't you think we all have been adhering to these norms because of the do's and don'ts of teaching that kind of craft to the media students? So I just wanted your comments on that. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I like that you said that. I mean, the thing that I would kind of hope, and it's like why we're even doing this today, is I like the idea that we are teaching kind of like a more kind of universal concept of visual literacy, visual language. And to me, it's sort of more important that the kind of historical base is tied into it and that everything is understood within a kind of greater context. The reason that I think I became so fascinated when I was given that class for the first time was there was this idea of masterpieces and then film history. And it was like, well, you actually kind of have to pick one. And if once you pick one, it actually dislodges the other, because film history is really filled with a lot of interesting things, but they're not given that stamp of masterpiece. And then what happens is you go against the syllabus, and it's a big, it's a big deal. But the thing that's been really interesting is if you kind of, like, I love looking at all the different theories. I love looking at the cultures and the subcultures within film and art, and students love it too. And you recognize that you can lead them into these different places. And so for me, I think it was more about recognizing that I was trying to disconnect things because I was at the time thinking like, well, these students they don't have the same kind of chronological base that we had. They can just, I can click on a link, it brings you to a new thing. And I realized that I had really kind of misjudged that. And I think when we're looking at what a classroom can do, even if you teach an artistic theory, I don't know that you should turn the class into an artistic performance. And I kind of felt that that was where I had learned a really interesting lesson that for me was kind of like circling back, which was I love that historical look at the development of the image, the development of the theory, and that I don't think one theory is better or more sound than the other. I don't think one film is better than the other. I think that everyone takes these pieces in, and then as Gallo said, it has an impact, and that's something you can't really teach. So you can only hope that you provide really good raw materials for the students. And I think that I had kind of over curated that one semester, if that makes sense.
Thank you.
Real quick, I'm sorry. One thing that I really love about what you're talking about, Michael, is the idea of like the interconnectedness of everything. I think that's something like when I give assignments now, what I've started doing probably like a year and a half or maybe more is I'm really explicit with what kind of what I want them to get out of it and explaining that things are connected, because I feel like there's this kind of tendency to like for students to think, well, how is this really related? So I think like with the proliferation of so much data and information, like things just become sort of narrowly categorized in some way. So, I mean, you're so right when you talk about like that idea of like us kind of curating and also being open to all the different things, because we, there it's what's happening is that there's no kind of viewpoint. So I mean, I just think that you're really right about helping students make those connections, between different art forms, between everything in life and how it relates to film, you know? It's so crucial right now.
Yeah, and I come back in this, but I was talking to this one film professor and we had a disagreement on two different filmmakers. And he said, well, the guy that I was speaking about, his movies were self-indulgent, but the movies he was defending were stylistic. And I thought, like, I don't know where you're drawing that line in the sand. And I thought to myself, like, my God, is this what I'm doing in my own classes? And that idea of me setting up the fence and saying on this side lies taste and on this side lies things that are not worth teaching became sort of like a messy point. And I'm trying to think of, how do you pack more in? How do you connect more stuff? And yeah, that was kind of a sobering discussion that I found rather interesting.
Super interesting.
Oh, there's raised hands. I didn't see. Oh, I don't know how to do that stuff. I see a raised hand. I'm happy to.
Oh, hello, Mr. Michael. Thanks for the excellent presentation. I had a question. I pursued my bachelor's in English, and one of the other subjects that I learned was film theory. And as we were studying, what this was really was this was a liberal arts class. So there were people from other fields who were also coming and studying our subject. And one of the biggest difficulties that we faced was that as art students, we didn't face the same difficulties. We didn't feel the need to go back after every class and sit for an hour to just understand the context of what was being talked about. Something, for instance, talking about noir films. It was, I mean, kids had seen noir films, but they couldn't understand the reasoning behind, say, the characters or the way the story is, how to say, structured and things like that. And all of this came down to context. I mean, we as an English student, we were forced to read books, right? We were forced to read lots and lots of genres. So it was very, in a sense, even if we didn't know about it, it was easier for us to relate to it. How do we create that ease of understanding context if somebody isn't related to say the arts field, right? Because I had kids in my class who were from commerce. These guys had no clue what cinema is. They have no clue what art is. For them, cinema, if you're in India, it's Bollywood, right? It's entertainment. It's something you see on the weekend. It's not really something that you would sit and analyze, say, what you see in a particular frame. Those things really did not make sense to them in any way. So how do we make that relation? Suppose if and I'm asking for a friend, right? Because I have friends who are interested in cinema but find it really difficult to watch anything other than Hollywood or mainstream Hollywood or mainstream Bollywood content. They just don't find it as how would you say, intriguing.
That's, I mean, it's interesting. And even though, I teach film and make film, like my real interest is writing. And even the use of the defamiliarization theory is really, me coming to it from this writer that I really like, Charles Baxter. So if anyone, he writes the best essays on writing. But this idea of trying to figure out how to provide certain context, and I think the problem that the thing that makes me nervous, I don't want to say I have a problem, but the thing that makes me nervous is if and when, because I had to go through film school, if and when a professor tries to supply the meaning and the significance of something that you've watched. I think that's not a good thing. And I think that film is an expression. And I think that whether the movie is being made to make money or it's being made to do something else, their idea is still to connect with people. And some are going to connect and some aren't. But the other thing is all these decisions that filmmakers are making, we can always look for the art in it, but all of these things cost money. And so when we look at even things that are stylistic, and people come up with all of these different theories. So maybe you've heard about like the French New Wave. And the French New Wave didn't shoot a lot of what Hollywood would call coverage, which is when you've seen, you film the wide shot, then you film the medium shot, then you film the close-up. And when people would watch French New Wave movies, they would look for the meaning in the long take. And then they talked to the cinematographers and he said, we didn't have enough money for the film to shoot coverage. So that was the only way we could film it. And so you realize you go searching for all these meanings and really they didn't have the money to make it look like it meant something else. So I think when you're looking at movies, whether you're coming to it from the perspective of someone who studies English or someone who studies science, you're going to find different things that you as a person value. And some of those things are aesthetic. Some of them are morality things or notions of humanity that you see in the story. So I think that film theory, as much as I think it's fun to read, and I think there's provocative ideas, I think that some people need to keep a little bit of a safe distance between turning it into sort of like Bible. And I think that was, I don't know if that makes sense. I think that ultimately that the viewer is really going to, you're going to supply the meaning to the movie. And that's where I get nervous that, you know, as I said, when I failed with Persona, I didn't ask the students to see it the way I saw it, but I was surprised that a student could not respond to it. And looking back, it wasn't for the reason that he said. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I'm talking in
Definitely.
circles. I apologize. Oh,
No, it
God.
makes total sense.
Oh my gosh. Putting me in the morning like this, I'm putting people to sleep. I saw another question I'm happy to answer.
Neil has a follow-up.
Okay,
Unless,
follow away.
yeah, he just did.
Can't unmute himself. Okay.
I just,
So,
yeah, just ask him to unmute.
there's another question that I see in the side about films using visuals to develop the idea of like sympathy and empathy. There's a really great quote by Roger Ebert, and actually this will go back to Neil. There's an American film critic by the name of Pauline Kael, who is easily she's one of the most talented writers I've ever read in my life. Aside from her ability as a writer, she had one of the best instincts for what films could do and how people could respond to them. And she believed that all these art films that we put up on pedestals, that it's very easy to make a confusing movie because you don't have to explain it, but it's really hard to make a movie that makes sense. And therefore, the idea of a kind of Hollywood movie that fired on all cylinders was in fact more successful than an art film that just like stared out windows and had no explanation. So if you really want to look at, it's not film theory, it's film criticism, but I recommend actually Pauline Kael and another person by the name of Manny Farber, who talks about the illusion of like film as art, when really it's just repetitive patterns. So I would say, if you're interested, those two are really big. As far as sympathy and empathy, Roger Ebert also said that great movies can turn you into great people because you can see how people live in the world and respond to it. When you look at, they do studies of the average length of a film frame or how long shots are up on screen now. They're speeding things up so fast that people can't study the film frame. And also when you watch people now in movies, they just blow them up left and right. And you see no blood, no violence. You just see the people kind of disappear, that they become these kind of objects in the frame. And it makes it hard to really understand the fallout of watching so many people get obliterated in a movie. So that's, some of the stuff that they talk about with the film frame and the ability to speed up the action so people can't latch onto it in a more emotional way.
About my follow-up, I think what I really wanted to talk about was how people, and I talk from the Indian perspective, people really are interested in talking about cinema, right? Because it's a part of our lives since we're very young. But the conversation around cinema, the way I see it in India, it's really uh, it's like there are two sides. There's one which is, casual, talking about cinema. I like this actor, I like this movie, and then the other one is, almost purely academic. And I see people from the first group wanting to be in the second group. They want to talk about cinema through a historical lens. They do want to understand the history, but they find no connections, because I mean, none of the writing that they read about, if they wanted to read about film theory or film criticism, none of it is Indian. They don't find that connection. But when they watch a movie, say like Taste of Cherry by Abbas Kiarostami, they do feel as if this is something that they've not seen before, but they sure as hell would like to see it again and again. It's not as if they don't have the capacity or the ability to appreciate it. They just don't have the words to put it into a conversation, right?
Then I would say that's the best thing I've ever heard. I think the last thing some people really need is to hear this kind of this like jargon around film, as if it, in a weird way, it separates what the film means to the person, and it superimposes this idea that it's doing something else that requires its own language and its own sense of meaning. And it's one of the things that really can turn off. It's a thing that I've noticed. It's a thing that can really turn off students to a thing they're very passionate about, which is if you talk to them about how to actually connect scene 1 to scene 2 and scene 3 in a narrative way. How do you light those spaces, and how do you work through the blocking with the actors to tell your story? That's something you can put your hands on. That's, kind of what I was obsessing over. That's making the stone stony. The minute you say this person's going to cross the room because it means the struggle of the human condition, it's like, oh my God, they're just crossing the room. And so what happens is you go kind of looking for these monsters to destroy, and it's really kind of a bit much. The other thing, and this one could get me in trouble in the big film circles, is that whenever people start talking about film criticism or film theory, you just see like the same 3 names of French theorists come up. And if you don't kind of buy into that school, if you don't buy into the Deleuze and the Derrida and the Foucault, you are banished, because you're like, no, I like Manny Farber. And they're like, well, he doesn't count. And it's like, I don't see how that works. So I think when people are, when people, as you said, they're casual and they want to have this other conversation, their connections are going to be different. And that doesn't negate them, even though the academic circle might. And I guess what I'm kind of looking for is this a little bit more of a non-academic approach to film that's really based more on our kind of shared values. Or there's another, she's actually a professor in Philadelphia, Camille Paglia, who's very controversial but very interesting. Her whole thing is if you really want people to understand film and art, they should really just study religions of the world. That's the basis of their values. Those values led to their generating images that described, that made visual those things that they most valued, and that would lead us up through art toward film. And that would kind of negate some of these theoretical things. And again, I'm not picking on all of them. I've read them. On some days they're fun to read, but it does sometimes suck the life out of a movie, which I think is a little frightening. Does that make sense?
Yeah, do you think that is what is playing into what you were talking about earlier, when you said that cinema is becoming, I'll just put it as dead?
I mean, it's pretty dead. There's no way to deny it, and it's really sad. I mean, I think that's the sad part, is I think they listed the Oscar nominations. I don't even know, because I don't care anymore. I'm looking at like the shows that I think are really well structured and shot beautifully, and I'm trying to follow. So like whether it's Ozark or even some of the comedies like Search Party, these shows that I think are actually doing something a little bit more interesting and are engaging people, and they're not making these big kind of sweeping social statements. To me, movies, it's really hard. It's become a lot harder to find the interesting stuff. You'd have to go to a lot of film festivals to see like what's being made. That the divide between kind of the major studios and the independent world has really become even bigger. It's sad because there's a lot of people making cool stuff, but I don't know that we'll ever see it. That was a depressing note. I'm sorry.
Thank you.
Sure.
Michael, can we end your session and we can have then the next one? Any
Yeah,
other
yeah.
questions from the audience? I think they just accept and perceive what you perceive.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate it. Thank you, everyone.
Good evening. Thank you, Michael. Brief introduction about Dr. Urszula. Dr. Urszula is an assistant professor of communication studies in Kutztown University, Pennsylvania. She holds a PhD in media and communication from Temple University in Philadelphia, PA. Urszula teaches social media theory and strategy, user experience, design and research, social media ethics, and communication research and writing. Her research focuses on digital technology, social media, user experience, online activism, and gender. Some topics she has studied and written about include the experience of women who use secret Facebook groups for support, community, and career advancement, how women strategically use Bumble and dating apps simultaneously find love and avoid sexual harassment, and how female entrepreneurs use social media to promote themselves. Over to you, Urszula.
Thank you so much, and thanks for having me. I'm going to attempt to share my screen. Okay. Does everybody see my PowerPoint? Okay, cool. It's amazing how I've been working on Zoom now for a year and a half, and I still can't tell if other people can see my PowerPoint or not. Okay, so my presentation is similar to Michael's in the sense that we both kind of draw on our students' experiences and connect them to our research. So what I'll be talking about is online privacy as a part of digital literacy. And I'll be sharing some sort of really informal research that I have done through conversations with students in my class at Kutztown University. So let's first talk about digital privacy. As we increasingly find, create, and generally interact with digital content, we both knowingly and inadvertently share information about ourselves and our lives, often really private information. So knowing how to keep our private information private online is a key part of being digitally literate. Researcher Kate Brains-Goldie explains that there are really two types of digital privacy. So there's social privacy and institutional privacy. Now, social privacy is managing what content can be seen by other users. So this is when you're thinking about front end of websites or apps, what other people in your network can see. Institutional privacy, on the other hand, refers to managing what information on users is collected and stored by the digital platforms and social media sites themselves. And research really shows that people tend to worry more about social privacy. So people worry about not letting other people see their information, or only kind of limiting what they're sharing to specific people. However, in 2019, the Pew Research Center reported that more and more Americans are also increasingly worried about being tracked and having their data collected by the digital platforms that they use. So there also seems to be a growing awareness of institutional privacy rights more recently. It's important to note that there are some differences by age in terms of thinking about privacy issues. So older Americans, those who are over 65, are less likely than young adults to feel that they have control over certain aspects of their online privacy, such as not sharing their physical location or keeping their private conversations online private. So against this background, I was really interested in I started thinking about as I was teaching this class as well, how do young people think about and act on digital privacy? Thinking about digital privacy as a type of digital literacy. So young people, those under 35, are digital natives, which are people who have come of age in environments in which the internet and digital media are an ordinary part of people's lives, and they have a certain comfort and agility with digital technology. So this semester, I'm teaching a class of digital natives. The class is called the Digital Self, and it focuses on the ways that people create, maintain, perform, and broadcast the self with and through digital technologies. So I have 51 students in this class. Most of them are digital natives. So this was kind of my informal sample through thinking about these questions. So in the first session of my class, I asked my students to reflect on their digital information sharing habits. I asked them to tell me the answers to 3 specific questions. How much information do you share about yourself online? Does the internet know who you are? And is who you are online the same across different sites or apps? And is this who you are online the same as who you are in real life? So what did I find? Firstly, I found that many young people share quite a lot of information online, but the majority of my students sharing lots across many different social media and digital platforms. So one student wrote, I'd say quite a bit of information is shared about myself online. If you were to do some digging, you would most likely be able to find out where I'm from, my phone number, and other personal information due to my LinkedIn profile, as well as Instagram and Facebook. Another student said, I share a lot online. My Facebook has a lot of my photos connected through albums between my Snapchat, Twitter, Tumblr, Facebook, YouTube, and music profiles with Spotify and Apple Music. You can pretty much find out anything about me. Yet another wrote this quote that I'm sharing with you here. When I think about it, I feel like a lot of information is about me online. I don't post very personal things ever, but there's a lot of basic information about me out in the internet space. If someone wanted to know my interests, hobbies, name, schooling, and job info, they could easily find it. I know that I shouldn't, but I actually share a lot about myself online. I share my innermost thoughts on Twitter, even though most people probably don't care. And I post photos of my friends and family on all sites. So you can see from these different examples that the type and depth of information that young people share is really a broad range. And I'm gonna go kind of into more detail as to why they share this and their motivations for sharing it. So the reasons for sharing so much varied among my students. A couple of reasons that I thought were interesting was wanting to keep social media public because they want to keep connected to as many people that they know as possible. So in some ways, privacy is superseded by the need for networking. So they want to make it easy for people I know to find them and keep up with their life. And quite a few students also actually use social media, not just for social purposes, but for business purposes. So they are entrepreneurs or bloggers or influencers. So they feel the need to share a lot of stuff because they're trying to promote their businesses. They're trying to promote their professional profiles rather than just their personal stuff. But that's still, because there's a kind of a fine line between being an entrepreneur or a blogger and a personal or an individual online. A lot of the information that they share as part of their business activities is still personal or private information. So importantly, different platforms are used for sharing different types of information. So for instance, one student wrote, how much I share definitely changes based off of what platform I am posting. So for example, I keep my Facebook account very clean since it's my family on there. However, my Twitter sees a more fun and relatable side of me. Another wrote, who I am is the same across the board of sites and apps. It's just different parts of who I am. For example, LinkedIn is my professional self. Facebook and Twitter are more what I'm interested in. And Snapchat and Instagram are like a snapshot of my life. Yet another explained, everyone who follows my Instagram, TikTok, or Twitter can easily figure out my basic interests, the town I live in, political views, and that I go to Kutztown. But I share more about my life on my private Snapchat, which has my friends and no snitches. So when students did limit sharing, it was, as the previous quote showed, because of their imagined audiences. So decisions about what to post were made based on who could view their content. One person wrote, which kind of really sums up the most common theme coming out in these discussion posts, that I have social media accounts, but they're all private. I still do not share that much information about myself. I try to be pretty selective with what I share and who I share it with. So when students are kind of making decisions about what information to share online, a lot of them decide by the law of the lowest common denominator. So they use blanket rules to share appropriately across all digital spaces. So one student wrote, I want my profiles online to stay professional and only share things that I'm comfortable with friends, family, and potential employers seeing. Another said, I don't post anything on any of my socials that would upset or hurt my family, friends, or strangers. And a third one said, I keep all my profiles clean in the sense of not posting alcohol. I don't want future employers seeing me as someone they cannot count on or trust. And then one student really summarized this type of attitude or sharing behaviors succinctly by saying, I do not like to post anything I would not want grandmom to see. Some other students thought about the imagined audience of each platform separately and shared content accordingly. So instead of kind of keeping it as PG as possible across all platforms, they decided that different platforms could have various levels of privacy or intimacy or intimate sharing in ways that others couldn't. So one student wrote, the amount of information I give out on the internet and different social media apps depends on the app itself. So for example, Facebook and LinkedIn are mostly used by employers to view you as a person. On these apps, I do add my school, address, work experience, relationship status, and so on. Instagram, I don't post too much personal stuff. My bio is pretty short. It has KU 21 in it, my boyfriend's name, and a few emojis of my favorite things. Another one said, I do keep Facebook a little more PG as a lot of family members are my friends on there. Yet others used features of each specific platform to create private audiences within the imagined audience of each specific digital space. So here's an example of one of these. One person wrote, I haven't posted anything in months to big groups of people. Instead, I have a private story on Snapchat that has a select few friends that I've picked to view my story. So using these different platforms in different ways really illustrates how digital natives navigate context collapse, which is the idea that different social contexts such as friends, bosses, family, or romantic partners all collide online, and it's difficult to control who the audience is for the content that you share digitally. So these examples from my class show that digital natives are really experts at navigating around context collapse, and how they choose to share different information is based on who is on these different platforms. What else this shows is that social privacy, limiting what other users can see, is really at the forefront of students' minds when they're online. But when it comes to institutional privacy, so thinking about how private information might be accessed by the platforms themselves or other companies that scrape data, my students were much less concerned. So first of all, many of them didn't even consider or think about that their data was being collected. They felt that the internet did not fully know who they are and that they felt really comfortable with what the internet knows about them. Others were aware of institutional privacy issues, but didn't talk about behaviors around limiting what they shared. So one wrote, the internet definitely knows who I am, considering that Instagram is now owned by Facebook, and the information that I share on Facebook is not the same as I share on Instagram. They can easily have access to my information from Facebook. I will have ads for the same products on both platforms. My discovery page on Instagram is literally perfect for my personality to a T, and my recommend for you videos on Facebook are spot on as well. So there's definitely some kind of understanding or knowledge that there is more being collected on you than you are actually actively sharing. Another student said, I believe the internet knows everyone to some extent through tracking from IP addresses and user accounts, as well as location services. I believe every individual has a digital footprint that can be linked to a specific person. And finally, another student said, based on documentaries I've watched and articles that I've read, I know that the internet collects data about me that social media platforms use to their advantage. The internet knows more about what I am interested in than what I publicly share online on purpose. However, out of all 51 students, only one student mentioned changing their behavior around such institutional privacy concerns. So they wrote, the internet knows my old self, not so much who I am today. After learning about privacy and about how one simple post can change your life, it impacted me to become private to big companies. Of course, I couldn't really pry regarding this. This was just discussion forums. So I don't really know what sort of actual behavior changes happened to become private to big companies. What's really interesting to see is that my students, who are, by the way, all social media students or digital media students and have had a lot of training around theories and issues of social media, they really only think about active sharing as a way of jeopardizing their privacy. So for instance, they don't consider that just building a profile or scrolling behavior is actually giving away information. Whereas in actuality, platforms collect and store everything from the second we jump online, and they use this information on us. And so you can't really manage institutional privacy unless you don't go online at all. So here's an example of students thinking that they're limiting the information they're sharing by not sharing. So I rarely post on my social media accounts. I just look at stuff. I rarely post, comment, or send messages. When being online, I choose very carefully what I want to share online. I rarely post any personal information, and I tend to make my usernames nothing that can relate to me in the real world. I try to live a really private lifestyle on the internet. Another interesting thing, I think related to this slide, is that many students kind of considered anonymity as equal to privacy. So again, they weren't considering institutional privacy issues around online companies collecting metadata such as IP addresses, location, geotags, and other identifiers that were not necessarily connected to their names. So a lot of them said that Facebook is tame, but Twitter is a collection of silly ramblings that aren't connected to my name. I use sites like Discord under generic usernames and avatars. So there's this kind of idea of control around privacy that is not actually reality when it comes to institutional privacy. Another thing that was really not considered is interdependent privacy, this idea that other people tagging you in things, sharing your location, even just sharing photos of you and not tagging you with facial recognition technology is giving up your privacy. It is being used, right, by not necessarily by people around you, but by companies. So most students only thought about the information that they themselves shared as related to privacy, but didn't consider that others in their network may be giving away private information. So the student here pointed out that they are actually tagging pictures with their family and friends, so people automatically know who is actually part of their life in real life. And I think what was most striking to me when talking about privacy and how much you share online was that most students don't really consider that even a little bit of information really sacrifices a lot of privacy, whether it is social or institutional privacy. For instance, this student wrote, I'm more on the private side with what I share about my personal life online. I'm more inclined to share pictures of what's happening around me, scenes, my cats, our new puppies, sometimes my kids, sharing about food or restaurants. And in non-COVID times, I share a lot about music and going to concerts and traveling. So this information that she says is more on the private side is really neither socially private nor institutionally private, because both the user's network and the platform she uses have access to pictures of her life, including her kids, her location, where she is. So in conclusion, this kind of really informal research shows that despite being known as digital natives and really being quite exceptionally digitally literate, young people are not very literate when it comes to privacy. And this is especially true of institutional privacy, which students rarely concern themselves with. And I'm not sure if this is because of a helplessness, like I don't have a choice to not share if I want to access services, if I want to use Instagram, or if I want to have a Gmail account, I have to share my information, or if they're just ignorant about how much of their data is actually being collected. So just from this kind of informal study, the conclusion really is that digital literacy, especially around digital privacy, is really important to keep teaching to young people. Because if students in the social media and digital media program have this kind of warped view about how private they are online, it means we have a real problem outside of this kind of really exclusive and well-educated in this particular topic group. So that's it from me. I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you. Any questions?
Hi, Urszula. Manjula here again.
Hi.
I just wanted to congratulate you for a wonderful paper. I think all the students, whether they are in Mumbai or they are there, they relate to this. And I can see Neil already saying great session. I think these PG students, the postgraduate students, do a lot of research in these areas in our department. And we realize that, you know, it's only through this kind of research that they understand what are the implications of it. So in your presentation, maybe I was a little distracted in the first 3 minutes. If I missed out, you can just tell me. You already touched upon it. One is, of course, this is Mark Prensky's concept, which is very relevant in today's time, digital immigrants to digital natives. I just wanted to know, how do you look at your students for news, for the right kind of information about things happening around? Do they, like the Indian students, stick to social media platforms most of the time for news? Or do they really look at the authentic sources to, kind of educate themselves? Because the more you tell them to read good newspapers or e-newspapers or check proper websites and portals, it's basically the social media. And we have a lot of jokes about WhatsApp University, which is doing a lot of stories which are absolutely trash. So
Mhm.
yeah, your comments on that, Urszula.
Yes, everyone uses social media for news. I literally don't think like my students, some of them even like know what a newspaper is. And not to say that they don't actually get some good news through social media. Like I, as a professor, probably use social media more for my news than any other source because it's a collection of sources for me. My timeline is basically a bunch of different news sources that gives me credible news. So I think, yes, they use social media for news, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's not credible. And I think there is a little bit of a difference. So like I teach exclusively social media students now, and I taught journalism students before that. And there's definitely a difference in terms of what is news. I think just from the kind of professional development from the studies that they have around what they like, the journalism students would really pride themselves on, reading the daily paper every morning and being really kind of involved in also local news. So I think it's, just partially what they're studying as well. Like my students in particular, because they're studying social media. So they're just like super immersed in it.
Thank you.
Sure. If anyone has any other questions, I'm happy to answer them. Shreyashi? Do I need to?
Yes, I personally had an opinion about the news being shared on social media. I believe that today the generation of the people of our generation, we tend to have our opinions on things validated, and the greatest audience we found, the mass of audience we find is online. So in order to get our opinions validated, we tend to rely more on social media and not the authentic sources of news, because we know it would be neutral and non-opinionated. Also,
Yeah.
also we see so many negative things happening around the world, so we try more to look at social media content that is wholesome. And that's why I believe our generation like to, either go full mode protest on things or just avoid it any means possible.
Yeah, I could definitely see that. And I think there is like being in the sort of I'm in the sort of middle generation where I guess I'm kind of a little young still, but also older. I can see that shift happening. I think in terms of being polarized, in terms of having our own little echo chambers that we just listen to stuff that, as you said, validates your own opinions. And then just having news fatigue, right? Like so much bad is happening all the time, especially in this last year, that you go to social media to look at cute pictures of puppies to make life more bearable. Any other thoughts, questions? Wow, this is the latest I've been up for about 10 years. Neil. Oh, I need to unmute you.
Before Neil starts, I must just on a lighter note say, you all should give us certificates for teaching Neil, because he's one of the brightest kids that we have in the department and he has all kinds of questions.
Okay.
You flatter me, man. Hello. Yeah, great presentation. I had a I was thinking you talked about digital privacy and you bifurcated the concept, right? And you're talking about institutional privacy, but the way I look at it today, a lot of it is really stuck in legislation. A lot of the things that are central to most issues of institutional privacy. And I mean, of course, I'm talking about American legislation right now. But it's central. There are a lot of things such as, is Facebook a publisher, or simply
A
an
neutral
aggregator?
platform. Yeah.
Yeah. And until these questions or these problems are solved, how do you think people should be educated on this topic? Because it seems to be quite up in the
Impossible.
air right now.
Yeah. And I think I identify a problem and I just don't know how to solve it, because you're right. It is absolutely part of legislation. It's also so much part, there is definitely a helplessness to it where you just cannot avoid it. You cannot avoid giving your data up unless you want to be like living in the woods with your puppy. To take part in modern life, you have to give up institutional privacy. And yeah, I mean, I think for me, the interesting part was in this research was just the conceptions of it, that people weren't talking about like, oh, I know that I'm constantly sharing with the platforms anyway, and I know that every like just the knowledge of it rather than what to actually do about it. I mean, I would argue getting off social media would be a good start. We don't have to have social media, but I don't think that's the reality for most people. So I think, yeah, fighting for legislation, fighting to keep our data as our data is an important thing to do. Maybe you'll be part of the fight. And then you can come up with solutions to institutional privacy issues.
Hi, Urszula, I have a question.
Yeah.
Yeah, so just a generic question, like how does peer pressure play an important role, like posting on social media and, like the role of peer pressure and, like what kind of stuff being posted and what impact does it have?
I mean, I think it's a huge, I think if you're not on social media, you don't exist. I was just actually talking to my class today. I teach a social media 101 class, and we're talking about networking and contacts. And, they were all telling me how when they meet somebody, they don't share numbers anymore. They share Instagram handles or Twitter handles, and then they just use social media to chat. So if you refuse to be on social media or aren't very active on social media, you're going to definitely limit your network. A lot of things that, part of culture, like memes that are shared, things that go viral, happen through social media. So you kind of left out of cultural conversations, like the water cooler conversations, as there would be called for old people who used to go to offices and watch TV. Yes, I think there's a huge part of it, especially for young people who are still trying to kind of find their identity and find their way in the world and make friends and are in a new environment. So yeah, and this idea of like branding yourself has been so incorporated into their, they see themselves as a brand, as something to put out there, and if you don't, you're kind of lacking.
Thank you. We have more questions.
Siddharth? I can't tell.
Hello, am I audible?
Hello?
Yeah, am I audible?
Hi.
Hi. So I have two questions. I'll try to merge both of them together. So my first question is, research has shown that social media causes a lot of anxiety, and not a lot of people can handle that. That relentless scrolling on Instagram and a lot of information overload tends to have a toll on the mental health of the user. And the next question is, and the next issue that I want to talk about is, um, when we're talking about privacy, digital privacy. Recently, WhatsApp introduced new privacy policy in India, which caused a lot of uproar, and a lot of Indians decided to switch to Signal, which is another message sharing app. So, do you think that there will come a time when people are really concerned about their privacy and the kind of information they are sharing, and there could be a time where there would be no social media, or do you think like that's like too big, uh, and too big an imagine too big a scenario to imagine, or do you think that you might end up making a better platform or better multiple platforms for users where their privacy is secure? What do you think?
I do think that there's definitely a move towards people understanding more and more about their data being collected, and there is an increasing uproar around privacy issues. And it's not just privacy issues, but the fact that the social media companies are profiting so much from our data. It's not just that you're giving away your data, it's that you're making somebody else billions of dollars. Like, I would like those billions of dollars that are used from my identity. So I think, yes, as people keep fighting against it, there's going to be some sort of change, hopefully some sort of legislative change. But also just think, as people get older, I mean, I've noticed this with my students as well, that a few of them I've had for, a couple of years now. And as we talk, they just say, I've really noticed that as I keep getting older, I keep caring less about social media and I just keep posting less. And I don't think that that's like a thing that everyone is suddenly going to stop using social media. And social media is definitely beneficial in a lot of ways. We talk a lot about the risks and mental health issues, data privacy issues, but it is a great connector. But I think just naturally, as people grow older, they tend to share less on social media for sure, and probably move away from social media as a thing. So I wonder if it's like it's going to be a generational shift. Yeah, I don't know. It'll be interesting to see. Thank you. No problem. I'm happy to finish up, to keep answering questions, whatever.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi. This is Rashmi. Thank you so much for a lovely session. I have a
Sure.
question for you. In today's world, social media is really important to build a presence for your brand. So, how important do you think is for businesses to build an online presence and connect with their audience?
So I think it's actually more important for businesses to be on social media than it is for individuals to be on social media. If you're a business without a digital presence, you're wasting a bunch of potential customers. I think it's one of the, even like as much as I teach social media, I'm not a huge social media person, partially because of the privacy stuff and partially because I'm old. But I definitely buy stuff that is marketed to me, as much as I'm like, oh, they're taking my information, they know what I want. But then they like show me the cutest shoes or like the perfect blanket, and then I buy. So I think it's crucial for businesses to be on social media, and more importantly, just online, right? To have a digital presence. Like, how many times have you looked up some place of business and they don't have a website? It automatically takes away credibility if someone is not findable online.
But don't you think the market is saturated with too many brands, the same things, and they're all on social media and everybody's just trying to set themselves apart, and it's just a little difficult to do that?
Sure, that's why so many businesses fail. But I think, like, even without social media, the market is saturated, and I think people keep finding like new ways of sharing or new ways of promoting things. And I think new products are still being created that are, and actually you'd be surprised that like I know, because I've been buying a lot of stuff lately, that sometimes I search for stuff and I search and I search and I search and I still don't find the thing that I want. So that to me means that the market is not saturated, that they're not absolutely reaching their full potential in terms of reaching me as a customer. And I think, you know, social media is not new, but it's also not that old. It's only really been fully like actively around for about 15, 20 years. So I think there's still like markets are still going to figure out how to get customers, get more brand recognition using. I think there's still a lot of innovation, I think is what I'm saying. Especially when like VR and AR are coming out, I think that's going to be a really huge thing in terms of interaction with consumers, being able to do some augmented reality or virtual reality with products, especially.
Thank you.
No problem.
I think we're done with the questions. Anybody else wants to raise a hand? We can unmute them. So we should thank, first of all, Zoom for giving us uninterrupted service. We are slaves of technology. It's just getting proved even more in a bigger way now. Yesterday we had the films, and I think Srinivas and his team really managed to screen them without any snag or any problems. So once again, a fantastic session we had here with, thanks Apurva, with Michael and Urszula. Urszula, we take a little time to pronounce your surname. So if you could just tell, how do you say that?
It's Pruchniewska.
Pruchniewska. Okay.
Yeah, perfect. First try. Thank you for having me. It's been great.
Thank you so much. Jennifer, when are you sharing your next film with our audience?
Ooh, I'd love to come back next year and show you my new film.
Great, great.
Yeah,
So this time we have Michael and Urszula also joining, I'm sure. Yeah. Thank you so much. And a special thanks to Anita ma'am for initiating this whole process. Our principal, Dr. Hemlata Bagla ma'am, I think she's in a meeting. She couldn't join us in the morning today, but we will be having more sessions where we will discuss our future projects, what we are going to do. There will be a fresh session in the month of May, which will be of documentary films. Our undergraduate students are making some real good documentaries, keeping the pandemic in mind also. Yeah, thanks, Jennifer. So I'm getting a little empty classes right now because of the shooting and people stepping out to shoot a few things. But yes, thank you so much for your late evening session and the early morning session for us. And we look forward to such sessions in future. And thank you so much once again for the lovely audience. 251 of them are there. So thank you so much for being there. And keep attending like this. We have another session by Jaya in the afternoon, which is like really middle of the night for you. So I would not want you to be there, but we will share the recording if you want. She's also a fantastic filmmaker from Wales, and now she's moved to Liverpool, right? Liverpool in China campus. So again, a very interesting conference speaker we have been regularly having. So she talks about her journey in the second half. So thank you so much. With your permission, Michael, we can close the session.
Sure. I just want to say thank you again. And for everyone to stay safe, and hopefully we'll be able to see each other.
Today, Shop Bradley Shop, right? He couldn't come today for this.
Yeah, we were hoping he was going to make it. I was scanning the participants to see if he made it or if he skipped on us.
Okay.
But I didn't see the name. So yeah.
Okay.
But thank you very, very much. It was
Thank you
really
so
great
much.
doing this.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.